The 5G is at such a high frequency that it dissipates or attenuates very quickly in space. So you have to have antennas much closer to the receiver now. All right. So we're used to large cell towers, maybe half mile, a mile away. Oh, yeah, there's the cell tower, right? But 5G is going to be a different creature. We're going to have little miniature antennas everywhere. They're going to be on every power pole and they're going to be everywhere, thousands of them. Okay. Because again, they can't be far away or we wouldn't be able to use them for this communication. So they got to be everywhere. And that's the concern, is that now you're going to be bombarded with this energy everywhere you are, and relatively high frequencies, tens of gigahertz that we're not used to. There's been very few studies of those frequencies. And some have shown some problems for mice. Some have said, no, it's probably, not going to cause problems. My thing is, I don't know. And I have a little concern about it myself. I have concern about the safety of 5G. And I don't know that anyone will know it until it's probably deployed for a period of time. And that's a shame. Now, the question then is, what do you do about it, right? Because you're not going to stop 5G. It's rolling out. And everybody's going to love the fast Wi-Fi, the fast internet and all that stuff. It's going to be great until people get sick and those kinds of things. And so what do you do about it?
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions. Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. It's a privilege to invite this guest back on. Dr. Arthur T. Bradley is a PhD electromagnetic engineer. He knows all about EMPs, electromagnetic pulses, and he's taken steps to create not only the disasterprepare.com website, but also some actual products that people can use to help protect their homes, their families, and even solar systems from EMP attack. Dr. Bradley, thank you for joining us again here on Reluctant Preppers.
Sure. Thanks for having me on.
We know you've been working on this EMPStorm Whole-House Protection project for about a year or so, from the conceptual stages through development and so on. We've had you back on a couple of times to give us progress updates, and love to get a further update on where that project is at. And also, we understand that you've got a new product in the works for protecting solar systems, which has been one of the most commonly asked questions by a lot of our viewers, because they want to reduce their risk of a grid down situation. So they think, oh, I'll put on a solar system as an alternate source of energy for my home, and then they're concerned about the potential risks to that system itself in the case of an EMP. So could you start off by giving us kind of an update on where your EMPStorm whole house protection has been coming?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I've got one of them here. This is one of the early prototypes, just so you can see what it looks like. And the idea of the EMPStorm is to install it essentially at your breaker panel. And its job is really to protect against the conducted effects of an EMP, right? It's not going to protect against the radiated effects, the things that travel through the air. But by and large, the most damaging effects from an EMP are going to come through the power lines. They're going to be conducted effects, the high currents that are going to come through the power lines. So the EMPStorm is meant to suppress that energy. And it does so, I've talked about it before, it's really got three different stages in it. The first stage is meant to sort of curtail the E1 pulse, which is the really brief pulse. The second stage is meant to clip the E2 pulse. And then the third stage is really to try and trip the house breakers in the event of a long duration pulse, which makes it a little bit unique. I don't know of another product that specifically was designed with three stages to address an EMP. So it makes it kind of unique. But in terms of its status, it's currently at Underwriter Labs. I think I might have been there last time we talked. I can't remember if we were quite there yet or not. But I submitted it to them must have been about 13 weeks ago. And I waited patiently. They said don't bug UL, but after a few weeks you get a little impatient. I started calling every other day, and they really didn't have anything to say. They just kept saying, we're reviewing the design. And I started getting nervous, like, well, is there something not right about it? And finally, I got through to the right person, and they said, oh, we're in the middle of an audit. And I said, what? And they said, yeah, we're in the middle of an audit, and we're not doing any device certifications right now of this type at all. I said, well, how long is it going to go on? They said, I don't know, it could be a couple of months. I was like, what? So it took 10 weeks for them to get through what should have taken about a week. So it took 10 weeks. After 10 weeks, they came back and said, yeah, design looks really good. In fact, there's some unique things here we want to talk to you about. So I had a lot of discussions with their designers, and they said, yeah, we love neat stuff. All of them kind of look the same, but this is kind of different. We like that. We talked about some things, concerns they had, make sure it was going to be safe. And so they're currently getting through that phase and into the second phase, which is where they take 50 units. So I have to have 50 units delivered to them, and they destroy those 50 units in a number of ways. High current injections, they drop hammer. I mean, they just do a bunch of things to test the safety of it. When they get done with those 50, they come back with the ratings and the results of those tests on the product. That's where we're at right now, is they're in that phase.
Wow. Yeah, it was 4 months ago we had you on, so I guess we must have just preceded. I think you were just about to ship off units to that, and that's a huge investment of units to crash test. My goodness.
Yeah, it sure is.
I will ask you at the end how, if people want to get in line to receive one of these, what they need to do. But now, in addition to that product, for whole house protection, the EMPStorm, you had answered many questions from our viewers in the past about how to protect solar systems. So you've been working on that at the same time. I guess you did have some spare time on your hands with all this delay.
I had about 10 weeks.
Okay, so what'd you do during your summer vacation?
Yeah, so I spent the summer really taking a good hard look at protecting solar power generation systems. And in fact, what I did is I built up a solar power generation system, a full-up system, solar panels, inverters, charge controller, batteries, the whole system. And I developed a filter that I believed would work to suppress broadband pulses, which is what an EMP is, and installed it in the system, took a bunch of measurements, fine-tuned the design, really did a real hands-on, real-world design, put it in a real system. In fact, I created a video. I just posted it today on YouTube. If people check out my channel, which is Disaster Prepper, they can find out. They can take a good look at that video, or you can mention it. But anyway, so I did that full-up test this summer, and I'd say the product is essentially complete in its design. I'm in the phase right now where I'm trying to cost it. And the difficulty is, there's a reason why people don't build these, like just regular commercial companies, and it's because the parts in it are very expensive. You can build little cheap filters for solar power generation for like maybe $70 or something, and they do have those, but they won't do anything for an EMP. And to put in the product, the components that will protect against an EMP are a little bit expensive, so I'm trying to whittle down the manufacturers and figure out, if I bought it in bulk, what could I get it for? I should know that in the next, couple of weeks or so. And then I may start letting people order it and that kind of thing.
Interesting. Yeah, that's certainly going to be of high interest, because a lot of the questions from viewers was around that very topic. In fact, speaking of viewers' questions, we've got quite a list of them here, and I wonder if we could go ahead and dig into a few of these.
Sure. Let me show you a little prototype of my EMP Shine
before
I forget about it. So the name of the product is EMP Shine, because the other one's EMPStorm. I thought Shine, the sunshine. That was my daughter's recommendation. Anyway,
we'll go with it. Yeah.
So this is what it looks like. It's in a metal enclosure. It actually has to be in a metal enclosure because it's really trying to block very high frequency energy. If you did it in a plastic enclosure, the energy just jumps right around it. So anyway, I've got some videos of it on the web people can take a look at. These are just prototypes. The final unit will look a little more polished, but that's what it's going to look like. It's going to be about that big. So anyway, but I'm happy to answer your users' questions about any topic that I can.
Okay. We have this one from Igitha, who says, would like to know about personal security, personal computers, hard drives, printers, and more about safety and efficacy of Faraday cages. So maybe we take that in two steps. EMP concerns about personal computers, hard drives, printers, and then we'll talk about the safety. And you've definitely talked to us in the past about efficacy of Faraday cages. We haven't really addressed safety issues around that. So if you could kick us off with personal computers, hard drives, printers.
Yeah, so all of those contain solid-state electronics. I think all the devices you mentioned there. And solid-state electronics are definitely susceptible to an EMP, both from the radiated effects. Again, that's the effects of the electromagnetic waves coming through the air, as well as if they're plugged in, then you can get the conductive effects through the wires, the power wires. So they're definitely able to be damaged. The single most important thing you could do to protect those types of electronics is not have them plugged into the power if you don't need to. So if let's say it's just a backup computer that you don't use very often, you would want to keep it unplugged. If you have the ability, you could keep it stored in like an EMP bag or a Faraday cage as well. That would certainly help. But keeping it unplugged is really important.
Is the idea of keeping it unplugged just to keep it from receiving the conducted pulse? Is that the whole idea there?
Yeah, that's right. And that's where most of the energy, most of the damage is going to be done from the conducted pulse. So if you can disconnect from the power grid in any way, shape, or form, it will help you.
Okay, how about the second part of that question about the safety and efficacy of Faraday cages?
Yeah. So in terms of safety, I guess they're talking about like persons not getting harmed by the
That's
Faraday
the
cage. Is
guess.
that the idea?
Let's talk about efficacy first, because you've certainly what are the key elements of effectiveness of a
Sure.
Faraday cage, and
Yeah.
then we can zoom in on any safety issues that might be.
Okay. Yeah. So you can make a Faraday cage out of anything that's conductive. And really, the thickness of it really only has to be about the thickness of a heavy duty aluminum foil. That's roughly the minimum thickness you'd want to have. All right. So if you think of anything that thickness or greater is going to make a good material for a Faraday cage. The ideal Faraday cage is completely enclosed. There are no gaps, there are no seams, there are no holes, right? So you could imagine such a thing if you fully wrapped up something with aluminum foil, you can kind of create something like that. And that makes a very good Faraday cage. Realistic ones, however, people find, they need some way to get in and out of them, right? So you usually end up with a lid, or you end up with maybe a bag that you have to open the top up, that kind of thing. That's where the weakness comes in typically for the Faraday cages. So you want to pay a lot of attention to those seams and gaps. It's not the small holes. I always tell people it's not the small holes that compromise a Faraday cage. You can actually take a drill and drill holes in a Faraday cage, and it doesn't really affect the performance very much at all. But if you take a razor blade and you put a slice along the side of it, it will compromise it significantly. So it's the long seams that end up really compromising it. So when you're building a Faraday cage, like let's say people use the garbage cans, people love the big metal garbage cans, and they work great. You can think about when you put that lid on, there's that big seam around the outside of the lid between where it mates on the can. And that is, in fact, where all the energy leaks into the can. And if you can seal that lip up, then the Faraday cage is fantastic. And so I always tell people just pay attention to those seams.
When you say seal, you're not just talking about airtight seal or watertight seal. You're talking about a conductive tape or something like that?
Yeah, there are a number of ways to do it. So you can use conductive tape, just like cheap aluminum duct tape. You can tape around the outside of the can. That works great. It's cheap, but if you've ever worked with that tape very much, it's a pain in the butt to pull on and off. You can slice your fingers up. So a lot of people will buy, I sell them on my website, disasterprepare.com. They have little conductive gaskets. I tested a number of them out to find just the right size that would fit inside those cans that would still let the lid go on and off. And those gaskets, they're not super cheap. They're like $40 for a set, but they work fantastic. I mean, you'd think 2 little strips of metal, $40, that's crazy, but they're just expensive. They make them, they're very nice. They have a little sticker on the back, so they stick to the inside of the lid, and then the lid fits nice and snug. And the can gives you 75 dB or better protection, which is fantastic.
Any personal safety concerns related to the use of Faraday cages?
There's not really that I'm aware of. In EMP, people often think there's a lot of rumors, and we've talked about some of these, where that there's so much energy released, things are going to become hot, or there's going to be a discharge, electrical discharge, and you might be shocked if you're touching something. But if you actually look at it, none of that really comes true. The amount of localized heating from an EMP is not measurable by a person. You wouldn't know if you had your hand on something metal and EMP happens, you would never know it. And likewise, there's not really a discharge path. You're not doing like an electrical breakdown, like lightning, let's say, right? If you had your hand on something metal and lightning hit it, you might very well take some of the energy. But EMP is a little bit different. It's an electromagnetic wave, and the electromagnetic wave wouldn't break down the air. So you really don't have any issues with the Faraday cage causing any kind of safety concerns.
Okay. Electric Pirate asks, anything about nuclear plants would be appreciated. Ability to self-sustain, danger radius, anything will help. So concerns about risk directly to the operation and safety and integrity of nuclear plants and those living around them in the case of an EMP?
Right. Yeah, that was a question I had, I guess, about a year or year and a half ago. I had that very question. I think it's a very important question. We have 99 nuclear plants in the United States, which I didn't know that at the time, but we do. And so that's how they're scattered all about, mostly along, you can look at the eastern where I live, and I can count them up and down the coast. So it certainly was a concern. And so what I did, we might have talked about this before, is I called one of the nuclear power plant companies, and I wanted to come by and visit them and conduct an interview. I told them who I was, and I wanted to write an article that was objective, that would evaluate the safety of nuclear power plants versus an EMP attack. And I was surprised they didn't hang up on me. They were actually pretty open. Now, of course, they have a line, which is, we're safe, right? I fully expect them to say that, right?
Yep.
But they were willing to spend an hour and a half on the telephone call with me. And I asked them one question after another. And what I learned was it did make me feel better. They have a number of safeguards in place. And I learned all about storing nuclear fuel rods and how the U.S. has a really weird system where we essentially keep them on site at the nuclear plant sites, which is very dangerous in my opinion. And even in the manager's assessment, I could tell he did not like that. They had to store them. So there were a number of risks. So one was the reactor itself, that the reactor might go uncontrolled and overheat. We'd end up with another Chernobyl kind of thing. But he assured me in a number of ways that that's not going to happen. Even if power were immediately cut, the nuclear power plant itself provides its own self-feedback system to keep power. And even if it didn't, there's a dead man switch inside the reactor that cuts it down within a second or two. So there were a number of safety mechanisms by which the nuclear reactor itself would come down. It took a couple of days. You had to keep it cool while it was trying to come down and all of that. But they had systems to keep the water flowing in it, even with power without. Had tons and tons of giant generators on site, as well as backup emergency generators that could come in if those main generators failed. So they had a number of backup systems. And worst case, they're generally placed by large bodies of water, and they had the ability to essentially bring that water on site. And they could essentially flood the facility if they had to. So there was a number of safeties. So I came away thinking that the reactor itself is very unlikely to go essentially superheat and explode, and it has those kinds of problems. I'm not going to say it couldn't happen, but I think it's unlikely. The other concern, though, was those nuclear rods that are stored there, right? And what my understanding was, it's been over a year since I looked at it, but they essentially are taken every so many months, 3 to 6 months, out of the reactor, a number of them, not all of them, but like 1/3 each time, and stored in a large swimming pool on site. And so this giant swimming pool, these nuclear rods they put in there, and I think it's a boron-infused water. Anyway, they keep them essentially cool, and they have to do that for years. They have to keep these things cool for years. And then they eventually, when they get cool enough, they move them out into these concrete casks, which are basically what they sound like, big storage things on site, where they put these, no longer, super hot fuel rods stored in there. And then I guess eventually, after many years, they move those off to central storage places. But the U.S. has a very weird system where we store a lot of potentially dangerous materials on site. And that was the one part I came away most concerned about, was those pools, they have to be constantly recirculated with water, with this boron-infused water. And if they're not, they'll just boil the water off. And if they boil the water off, then they release all this gas, and the gas can rupture and cause explosions, and then you release, nuclear material into the air, and it can spread and cause lots of problems. Chernobyl type events, right? So that certainly there is some danger there. Again, the people who ran the plant gave me lots of assurances, the same sorts of systems, the backup systems, the generators, the backup generators, all those things were meant to keep this stuff cool. They understand the risk. But I think if the failure were to occur, it would probably occur around those hot rods that are stored in the pools. I don't know how far away you'd want to be, far as you could be, if something like that went. I know there's some data I've seen out, within 10 miles there's a certain effect, and within 20 miles there's a certain effect. But I'm not an expert. I wouldn't want to throw out that kind of advice. But I would say, if you knew something like that was having a problem, you would want to put some distance between you and the nuclear power plant for sure.
It's interesting when you talked about it. You called it a dead man switch. Yeah, that was an interesting choice of words. Mike Marshall asks, I am surrounded by new Tesla automobiles here in San Diego. I recently read that electric cars give off high or dangerous levels of EMFs. Can Dr. Bradley speak to the safety of driving or being a passenger in electric cars?
Wow, I have not heard that, so I can't speak to that, but it's an interesting question, and I tell you what, I'll do a little homework and find out if that's true. Now, I will say this. I get emails weekly from people who tell me that they're dying from EMF-related illnesses, okay? And I take it very seriously. I'm not saying that in a joking way. I do. I get emails regularly from people. Mm-hmm. And people will ask me, what can I do to reduce the EMF and the electromagnetic energy around me? It's causing me all kinds of problems. And some of it is, I think, it's this invisible enemy out there, right? And if you're ill and you don't know why you're ill, then you can easily point to an invisible enemy and say, it's got to be that, because I don't know what else it could be. So some of the times I think it's maybe misattributed, and maybe it's mold in the house, or it's something else, right? Some other underlying condition. But with that said, I don't know that all electronic devices that are emitting RF waves and energy are perfectly safe for our bodies. I have no way of knowing that. There's a number of studies out there, and some of the results are inconclusive. High voltage power lines are a good example. There's been a number of studies that said, yeah, you probably shouldn't live too close to them. Cell phones are another one, right? There's been some questionable studies done that people say, yeah, the rate of increase in brain cancer certainly is, correlates to the amount of usage. So, but I'm not smart enough and educated in that area enough to say definitively, yes, this is a danger, and no, that's not a danger. But I don't belittle it. It is something to be concerned about. I hadn't heard that about the electric cars, though. So I'll do a little bit of homework just to find out if there's any truth to that. If I had an electric car, it'd be easy to tell. I could take my little spectrum analyzer, my antennas, and go out there and measure what the field levels were. And I got a guy at work that has a Tesla, so I may just do a real world thing and even make a video and post it or something.
Cool.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Sounds like fun. Cletus Smith asks a question we've already touched on, but now it drills in a little bit more. Just how vulnerable would a solar power array and all the electronics be to an EMP? Could you continue to use it after an EMP attack?
Yeah, so I did 2-part video on this very question, but let me do it in short. So the biggest threat to the solar power generation system is if it's connected to the grid, okay? So there are 2 different types of systems. Well, there's a number of systems, but you can certainly be grid tied. Maybe you're feeding energy back to the grid and you have a backup source from the grid, or you can be completely standalone. If you're tied to the grid, you're certainly more vulnerable because that giant pulse is going to come in off the grid and it can come into the solar power generation system and cause you damage. Now, installing an EMPStorm or whatever devices of your choosing on those incoming power lines could help because you're going to clip some of that energy off, all right? And I talk about that in that video. So even for a solar power generation system, something like an EMPStorm Whole-House surge protector could help protect it. Now, it doesn't solely protect the solar power generation system, though, because there's a number of pieces and components to that. There's the panels themselves. They come down these long wires, maybe go through a combiner box, and then come into the inverter and charge controller system. And then they ultimately go, if there's a battery system, they go down to the batteries. And so each of those has different susceptibility. So to talk about them all just briefly, the panels themselves, if they're freestanding and not connected, are pretty robust. All right, they're not likely to be damaged. If they don't have any wires attached, it's just the radiated energy hitting them, and they're actually pretty robust. I don't believe, and I've talked to an expert about this who actually builds these type systems, he didn't believe either based on his testing that they would be damaged freestanding. He'd done a number of tests that showed that to be true. So the panels themselves freestanding, you're okay. But once you hook the long wires to them, now all of a sudden you can bring lots of energy into those wires and it can flow into your system. So that was where the EMP Shine came up. Basically, the EMP Shine goes at the far end. If you have the panels at one end, the EMP Shine goes right before the inverter. So the energy that gets introduced on those panel wires flows through the filter, that EMP Shine filter, before it goes into the solar power generation inverter and charge controller. And I think that's probably the point of greatest susceptibility. That's where all that energy is going to come in through. You could certainly use ferrites as well. If you want to put ferrites, let's say, around the wires, the solar panel wires, that's fine. You can put them around the battery wires if you want to do that as well. And I recommend, those are cheap, tens of dollars. You could put those on your system. But the one thing that was really lacking, and I think it's probably the single weak link, was right there at the inverter input from the solar panel wires. And that's what essentially I'm trying to address.
All right. Silver Lining asks a question that would affect anybody who's maybe not a homeowner but an apartment dweller. What would you recommend for a suburban apartment with many restrictions on what you can do regarding keeping electricity and gas and heat running?
Wow. Yeah, apartments have their own challenges, right? You can't have quite the same flexibility that you could before. But you still can do some small-scale preparations, I think. So one way to do it is, it's really nice. I'm sure we've all been through a number of I know you've been through a number of blackouts because we've been on the air before when you had one.
That's true. That was one of our first interviews. We actually had a thunderstorm and a power outage, and we just kept sailing right on through because we had backups
kept on going. Yeah, so having an emergency source of electricity, even if it's not high amounts of electricity, is very, very helpful. And for an apartment dweller, probably the best way to do that is with a battery and an inverter. You can buy a portable inverter and have a heavy-duty car battery or something stuck in the closet, and that will at least let you have some energy. Let's say you're going to be out of power for a day. You can use that to recharge your cell phones or whatever kinds of things you might need. So that in terms of electricity, that's probably the easiest way. There are small solar power generation systems too. I have one in my closet actually that you can take outside and it just rolls out. It's like a little cloth. You roll it out and you can recharge your batteries and those kinds of things. But it's, again, you're not bringing in a lot of energy. It's just enough to do very small tasks with. And there are a number of other basic preparations you can have to try and stay comfortable, and kind of go down your laundry list. When I wrote the Handbook of Preparedness, I sort of have these 14 needs, and I talk about how you kind of consider those needs when you're preparing. Everybody thinks food and water, that's the best place to start, certainly. And that whether you're a homeowner, apartment owner, same idea. But you can think about, how am I going to get my information? How am I going to communicate with people? And on down that list. So I might just refer your reader to that book, and he can take a look and kind of go through and make up his own disaster preparedness plan.
Al, we've held up two different revisions of that book that my son gave me for two different Christmases and birthdays here, so I really appreciated those. We refer to them. Valerie Johnson says, I bought a solar generator that has 3 panels on wheels that came with it. If I wrap the boxes for the generator and extended service pod in several layers of mylar or solar blankets, will they be protected from solar flares or EMPs?
Right. Yeah. So that's a question I answered just recently through some testing. I put a video also out about that. Lots of people had asked me forever about solar blankets, right? These blankets essentially to keep you warm, when you're in some kind of emergency blankets, what they're called, I guess. Or mylar space blankets, another name for them.
Yeah.
So I did an experiment, and I tried to measure the effectiveness of what those mylar blankets, how well they shield. And as you'll see in the video, if you watch it, they don't do a very good job at all. So I do not recommend mylar space blankets to wrap things up with and try and protect them from an EMP. They just don't provide enough shielding. The metal is sputtered on this plastic, and it's just so thin. Yeah, super thin. And so you get about 10 dB of shielding at most, and maybe less than that, maybe 6 to 8. So anyway, I tested it out. I really wrapped it up really good, and then took the field levels, and it just didn't do well. And so,
however, on your website, you do sell some mylar bags or something. How big do those come?
Yeah, so the bags that I sell, those EMP bags, are anti-static bags, and they're much thicker amounts of metal on them. They're meant essentially to keep energy out of them or energy in them. And they come as large as 3 feet by 2 feet. So they're pretty good sized bags you can get. Now, you might not be able to put that generator or whatever she's got to put in it, but you can use aluminum foil to certainly wrap up those boxes. Just, that's cheap, right? Buy a big roll of aluminum foil and wrap it up. And aluminum foil does great. If you put 2 layers, you get a little bit better than 1 layer. So I always tell people, if you're up to it, wrap it up twice. And it does fantastic. I taught a class recently at a conference, and I got everybody their own little tote bin. We had like 30 people in this class, everybody these giant tote bins. I said, wrap them up as good as you can with aluminum foil, and then we'll measure the shielding effect. I brought all my test equipment. We measured them, each one after the other. And I told them before we started, I said, where the problem is going to be is the lid that goes on, right? It's going to be that seam right there. And sure enough, some of them were fantastic, 50, 60 dB of protection, and others that looked exactly the same were 12 dB. And it all came up as soon as they rewrapped that lid and did a little bit of effort, bam, did really great again. And so, like all things, if you can, keep those seams down, you can get a really good protection from aluminum foil.
Here's a different one. Wode Shaman says, are there any states or geographical areas of the U.S. less vulnerable to EMP? For example, in the event of an EMP, would some areas be less vulnerable due to distance from likely, quote, ground zero locations of the EMP? And additionally, what countries are less likely to be subject to EMP? I assume the southern hemisphere is less likely to be a target of an EMP attack, but what about EMP from solar activity?
Yeah, so EMP from solar activity is a different creature altogether, and it's often misunderstood. So you can have energy from the sun in a number of different fashions. We have solar flares, we have coronal mass ejections, we have lots of different things, solar wind and so forth, and they cause different effects on the Earth. The one that's most worrisome and the one that people think are going to take down the grid are the coronal mass ejections, which are basically a big plasma that gets thrown out of the sun, and that comes our direction and it comes across the Earth, right? These are huge, enormous plasmas. So plasma is just the charged particles. And our Earth does a pretty good job of preventing that from getting in and harming us, but it does perturbate our magnetic field of the Earth, right? And when it does that, anytime you have a time-varying magnetic field, you have currents, and those currents then flow in long conductors. And so that's how you generate these currents that come up in these very long power grid conductors or buried pipes and things like that. And those currents can be enormous. They can damage the power grid. And there's lots and lots of groups out there very concerned with, a solar coronal mass ejection taking out our power grid for many months, maybe even a year, because of these very large transformers being damaged. And I think that's a valid concern. There's not a lot of preparation we as individuals could do. I mean, I can't prevent the grid from going down. It's outside my realm. And I also don't have to worry about my freestanding electronics, like my little radio or my car or those things being damaged by that. They have to be miles long. Things have to be miles long to couple in that very low frequency energy. But if everything's plugged in my house, it could be damaged by that energy coming in on the power line. So that's, again, where something like the EMPStorm might help you, is it would curtail that energy and pull the breakers on your house and try and disconnect you from it. So it's a very unique threat. The solar events are unique. I don't know that, I mean, certainly the magnetic field lines are different around the Earth, and so things are perturbated differently. But I'm not an expert enough about our geospatial type questions like that to say this would be the better location than that from a solar type event. I couldn't really say. And you also have to weigh in the susceptibility of the grid components of those places. I don't know that anybody really knows that.
This is a hot topic. Matute11 says, does Dr. Bradley have anything for 5G, and does he have an opinion of? Well, we'll just start with that.
Yeah, 5G. So this goes back to my comment before about people writing me about concerns with electromagnetic energy, and I've had a number of people ask me about, hey, you're solving these problems. I appreciate it, but I'm really worried about is this new 5G coming. Mm-hmm. And my first reaction was, I'll be honest, it was people probably just overreacting about it. So I did a little bit of homework. I never try and go completely off the cuff without doing a little homework. So I did a little homework, and there is a concern here. There's a real concern about 5G. And the concern is that, the 5G is at such a high frequency that it dissipates or attenuates very quickly in space. So you have to have antennas much closer to the receiver now, all right? So we're used to large cell towers, maybe a mile away. Oh, yeah, there's the cell tower, right? But 5G is going to be a different creature. We're going to have little miniature antennas everywhere. They're going to be on every power pole, and they're going to be everywhere, thousands of them, okay? Because, again, they can't be far away or we wouldn't be able to use them for this communication. So they got to be everywhere. And that's the concern, is that now you're going to be bombarded with this energy everywhere you are, and relatively high frequencies, tens of gigahertz that we're not used to. There's been very few studies of those frequencies. And some have shown some problems for mice. Some have said, no, it's probably, not going to cause problems. My thing is, I don't know. And I have a little concern about it myself. I have concern about the safety of 5G. And I don't know that anyone will know it until it's probably deployed for a period of time. And that's a shame. Now, the question then is, what do you do about it, right? Because you're not going to stop 5G. It's rolling out. And everybody's going to love the fast Wi-Fi, the fast internet and all that stuff. It's going to be great. Until people get sick and those kinds of things. And so what do you do about it? Well, there's not a lot that we have right now today that would shield against 5G. And that's, again, because it's going to be in the tens of gigahertz frequency. So anything that's like in any kind of seams or gaps or holes, the energy will come through that very easily. So let's say, like, I have conductive cloth on my website to cover cars from an EMP. Well, that conductive cloth is made up of fibers that are interleaved, right? That 5G would pass through that cloth very effectively, and that cloth wouldn't block it well. So you'd need like a solid conductor, right? And a solid conductor would block it, but how do we as people cover ourselves in solid conductors, right? I don't know. There are some clothing you can buy, but again, clothing is that interweaved material, and it's not going to do a good job at 50 gigahertz or something. So what I'm looking at this fall, these questions are relevant because this fall I'm going to take a look at, I know we didn't even cue this up, right? We just sort of stumbled on it. But this fall, I'm going to take a look at conductive paints. So there's a number of companies that promise to block RF energy using conductive paint. That you could, let's say, paint one room of your house in this conductive paint and then paint over it with regular paint so nobody even knows it's there, right? But it would act as a mini Faraday cage of sorts against this very high frequency energy. Sounds like a great idea. Maybe a lot of people's bedrooms where you spend many hours, you don't necessarily need high-speed internet where you're going to sleep. You could be in a room like that where the energy levels were much, much lower, and that might have some health benefits. The question in my mind is, how well do they work? There's a lot of hype around everything like this. And so we're going to test, I think, the 5 leading brands. We're going to test those 5 against 5G signals. We're going to see how, tens of gigahertz, how well they shield. We're going to paint up little systems. We're going to see what the shielding is. And if they don't work that well, we may try and create our own composite paint that let's say one paint does really well in this frequency and another paint does really well in another frequency. Maybe we create some kind of composite that together would do it. I don't know. It's an investigation for the fall. If I get something cool, I'll be sure and let you know.
It reminds me, though, of what you've been talking about with any Faraday cage design as far as the seams. I'm just thinking of a bedroom with big windows and a door cracks and everything. It's like,
Yeah, no, you're not going to create a Faraday cage in that way, right? You're not going to be like 70 dB. Okay. But let's say you could create 25 dB, right? That's pretty modest, right? 25 dB is hardly anything. But it still is about 95% of the energy reduced, right? Now, that's not enough to block an RF signal where you can't receive it. You'll receive it all day long. You need about like 99.99% to block. But 90-something% of the energy brought down in terms of my tissue being damaged might be real important to me, right? And so, again, we'll have to take a look at that. I always say it's, you win your battles in little pieces. And so I'm looking for ways that might help with the 5G concerns.
Well, this one might seem a little far out. It was a different viewer asking a question about the potential for how well earth sheltered, or if you put a shipping container underneath the ground, would that provide any blockage from EMP? And I think you've addressed that in the past about how effective earth is as a potential block for EMP.
Yeah, earth is a modest conductor. It's considered a conductive element. But if you run the numbers, and I did this on a spreadsheet one time, you have to bury things pretty deep to get very much shielding to it. So burying a few feet in the earth isn't going to do a lot for you. It'll do a little bit, a few dB, but it's not going to do a lot. So, but a shipping container is another thing altogether. In fact, again, this fall when we're looking at that 5G thing, one of our other experiments was to take a look at a shipping container shielding effectiveness.
Okay.
Because it's been asked like 50 times. Everybody asks, how well do shipping containers work? And I don't know. Now, the metal's plenty thick enough, right? But the question is, what do those door seams do? And what are any other seams on the unit going to do? And so we're going to test it. It's easy enough to test. I'm going to get a shipping container, set up the receiving equipment inside, put a transmitter outside, and measure across frequency. My guess is the high frequencies will leak in through the door, but there may be a simple way to address that, which is with a conductive curtain. I think we might have talked about that before. Basically, you hang a curtain right inside the door that's made out of, let's say, conductive cloth, right? It's not that expensive. Maybe it costs you a couple $100 or something. And now you could come in and as long as you're on the other side of the curtain, you're in a nice enclosure. I suspect you could get very good shielding. But I'll take a good look at that. It's been on my list for several years now to do that. So it's a good question.
Well, Dr. Bradley, we've been asking you lots of these different questions. Has that triggered any comments or additional thoughts that you'd like to leave with our viewers before we let you go?
Well, I always do my usual, which is try and stay practical on things. EMP is one of those topics that people can go way far left field, right? And they tend to, get in the nuclear Armageddon sort of thinking, right, where the world's going to end. And maybe it is. Maybe an EMP really would set us back, 150 years or something. But it also could just have other kinds of disruptions, right, where we're without a power for a few months or something like that. And we have to learn how just to live on our own for a while and make do. And so I tell people, try and be practical with your preparations. Think about what are we going to eat? How are we going to stay hydrated? How are we going to stay safe? Those kinds of things first, right? Yes, protecting electronics is important because, we want to have our electronics. It helps us have a better life. But start thinking about those basic preparations at all, as well, so that you're ready for any kind of danger, whether it's an EMP or some other kind of threat.
If people want to find out more, both about your products and about your writing and your blogs and so on, where will they find you?
So they can go to disasterpreparer.com. That has a link to everything. They can also go to my product websites, which are EMPStorm.com or EMPShine.com.
We've been speaking with Dr. Arthur T. Bradley, PhD and EMP specialist. Dr. Bradley, thanks as always for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Sure, thanks for having me.
If you ever get hung up on another delay waiting for UL on anything, just give us a call and we got time for you. So.
Okay, great.
Take care.
All right, take it easy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
What if gold or silver drop in price after I order it?
Well, everything fluctuates with time, but nothing has held up longer and better than gold and silver throughout all the changes that have happened in history. Your first ounce of silver is at spot price, and you get free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/RP. Hey, Reluctant Preppers. If you haven't heard, we've already started our monthly 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle thank you gift to one active Patreon subscriber each month, signed by your host, Dunnigan Kaiser. And you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.